I'm Dr. Rob Owen. I'm out of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Prior to that, I was in the mobility world as probably the best C-130 pilot that ever flew the airplane, modestly speaking. And with me is Mr. Bruce Bussler, who is the director of the Joint Distribution Process Analysis Center, which is the U.S. Transcom think tank for just assessing how we're going to get the joint force out into the theater using the various modes of transportation that are available or likely to be available. So I'm going to cut from that and let Bruce begin his presentation. We're going to be talking about Transcom's view of the Indo-Pacific transportation challenges they face. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here today. On behalf of General Van Ovost, the commander of U.S. Transcom, I'm really happy to share with you some of the insights that we've generated over the last several years with an intense focus, obviously, in the Indo-Pacific theater. If you're not familiar with the Joint Distribution Process Analysis Center, we're very unique as a combatant command organization. It's the combining of all of the analytic and engineering talent within both Transcom and the component commands. We're about 200 strong. And one of the key things that we provide for not only Transcom, but really for the Department of Defense is major mobility studies. And what I thought I'd do today is give you some insights, unclassified insights, into where we see the current condition of the mobility enterprise and the challenges that we anticipate within the theater, specifically within the vast expanse of Indo-Pacific. And again, I wish I could go into a classified level discussion. I could do this for an hour and give you, I think, a lot more, but I think you'll get a sense of the real challenges that we see here. And again, the other focus I'm going to provide is really the context for what is the joint force need across all domains, not just the air domain. And there are some areas that you may not anticipate as challenges, but airmen need to understand, the bigger joint logistics challenges in the theater to really anticipate how you're going to get ahead of those problems and to be able to manage those effectively. So next slide, these are the topics I'm going to talk about real quickly. But I just wanted to talk about what we call our warfighting framework at U.S. Transcom. By a show of hands, how many people have read the 2022 National Defense Strategy? That's really important, I think, and I'm glad to see that many of you have seen that document. That really is pivotal in terms of where we're at today. And before I go into each of these different areas, I wanted to kind of reflect back on why strategies have consequence for mobility operations. For many, many years, we had a two major war construct where we had to have the ability to project and sustain forces in two theaters nearly simultaneously. And that changed in the mid-2015 period, that time there under the Obama administration when they went to something called defeat deny. And then, of course, in 2018 under the Mattis strategy and then the 2022 strategy, now it's focused on great power competition and potentially great power conflict. But the real challenge there is it's now kind of compressed the nature of mobility forces, especially those that were tied to the theater. So specifically C-130s and air refueling have become, I'll call it right-sized to be able to meet the needs. But if you look at this framework, what I really wanted to draw your attention to is typically we focus on mobility, capability, and capacity. And for Transcom, we focus about 10 to 15 years in the future, try to influence both the Department of Defense and inform the Congress on where we see risk. And that's the area that we typically look at. But on the other side, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that global mobility posture, how we look at the networks and nodes, access space and overflight, where we can anticipate operating from, has really a tremendous impact on mobility operations. And many of you that have been in the Pacific theater recognize that the distances are quite extensive, and where we can get basing and where we can operate will be critical, especially in areas like air refueling and to the degree that we can operate relatively close to flight. And later on, I've got one slide that talks about the nature of how we'd be pushed back to some degree. On the other side, though, I wanted to highlight where General Van Ovost, and I know that General Sullivan was here earlier in the week and talked about some of the Transcom themes, but a week ago at NDTA, she rolled out her priority effort for her last year in command. That's really going to focus on decision advantage. This has to do with how we look at the globe and how we look at this as a problem and integrate that to the scale we can understand and anticipate the problems in the future. So for us, not only do mobility modeling and simulation, but we're also trying to provide decision advantage support through predictive analytics and other means to help us see the problem, anticipate it, and then help us shape and inform options where we still have the opportunity to actually influence outcomes. And so in the middle of that part that's really kind of key is looking at both transportation and air refueling for how we are sufficient to be able to meet the requirement. And again, one of the things that alarmed me to the point where I wrote an article last year in Joint Forces Quarterly that really identified the mobility enterprise is about as small as it's been since the end of the Cold War. And what that means for us is that if you look at the nature of the power projection problem, we have fewer assets to do, the radius is being constrained, and we have to be able to operate over distances that are quite extensive, what we kind of had sized for before. But this really is the backdrop for how we look at the totality of the problem, for how Transcom assesses our ability to operate all three of these areas, and whether we have elevated risks. And I'll talk about some of those risks again in just a slide or two here. Many of you may recognize this is kind of a backdrop that I use to be able to talk about how Transcom assesses their ability to operate. You may recognize that a majority of our joint force is still based in the CONUS. One of the things I've evaluated, and I think will be a challenge, is we cannot pre-pour our posture our way out of this problem in the Indo-Pacific. Even if we have to set conditions in the theater, we're still going to have to project forces under a very timely response to be able to do that. So it probably is obvious to you, but what's different between China specifically versus even Russia or North Korea when we did that as the size and before was it is a long-distance, high-velocity warfight. And so the very first area we're going to put a tremendous amount of pressure on is going to be airlift, strategic airlift specifically. And that is not only our organic assets, where now we have 275 C-5s and C-17s, but also the ability to integrate craft, and the ability to operate them at distance as well. Many of you recognize the minute we become contested, we'll have to transload at distance, and those locations are at midpoints that are still fairly far away, like Alaska, Hawaii, and Northern Australia. And then right behind that, of course, area fueling will be providing the means of projecting combat forces to the theater, but even more importantly, employing them in an environment that's becoming quite challenging for area fueling. And not only is area fueling having to support the Indo-Pacific warfight, but we recognize that the warfighting challenge, the NDS, is really a global problem to where we have a homeland defense challenge and a strategic deterrence challenge in combination with the employment against a great power adversary, which really confounds how area fueling operates. And so we tend to focus on the employment in the Pacific, but really it's a global problem. Our ability to manage that at scale simultaneously is really the big issue there. And many of you may recognize we still have a very potent and very capable strategic SEALIFT fleet. That fleet is aging. We're at average 44 years today, a heavy effort with the Navy to recapitalize that. The challenge for the SEALIFT contribution versus both a Russia or Korean problem is that you really only get one pump of that fleet because the distance is involved. And by the way, if you haven't thought about those distances, the cycle time to Europe is about 24 hours for an airlift aircraft. It's about 50 hours to the Pacific. About 10 days for SEALIFT, and almost 3 weeks to go to the Pacific. So it really is a much bigger challenge to be able to project the force into the Indo-Pacific using these assets as well. One of the things you may not think about is right on the heels of moving forces to the theater will be the ability to provide them with key warfighting commodities. And we have to project and sustain the joint force. One of the areas we're very concerned about now, to the point that the Congress elevated this to a UCP mission that was given to Transcom on bulk fuel. And the area that we're quite concerned on, we used to think about moving fuel from source of supply to points of storage, and operating from those points of storage. Now we have to not only move fuel in the Indo-Pacific, distribute that to many, many different locations across the Indo-Pacific, and look at emerging concepts such as fuel float storage, the ability to look at dynamic response in a much different way than we had looked at before. And just about 2 years ago, we provided a response to the Congress where they were very concerned here, and that generated a thing called the Tanker Security Program, to where we are now able to use the stipend to bring on some tankers under the U.S. flag. We're only going to be able to use 10 of those, and for the over-ocean tanker, we'll need about 50 of those, and for the Indo-Pacific theater, where we need smaller size ships, we need about 100. We're heavily dependent upon foreign flagged assets, to where we do not have in our inventory today many of the agreements we might have to be able to gain access to those. As a matter of fact, many of you may recognize that we only have one bilateral agreement, that's with Korea, a thing called the Korean Flag Shipping Program, and for airlift, a thing called the Mutual Airlift Support Agreement, and we're now working with OSD Policy to help us enhance the ability to get access to foreign flagged assets. So if you recognize allies and partners as a key part of the strategy, this is one area we really have to accentuate and heavily leverage allies and partners to be able to contribute to what operate in the Pacific. So you may worry about fuels and bladders, but you have to worry about how do you get the fuel to those locations as well, and this is an area that we're quite concerned about. And the last area I'll point out is I put it under theater lift in generic sense, because theater airlift and theater SEALIFT will both be challenged. The issue we have is going to be just like fuel, the ability to move over the over-ocean distances in the Pacific theater will be challenging because the Army and the Marine Corps have not invested in some of the assets they have. You may have heard of things like the Maneuver Support Vessel Heavy, which is a watercraft for the Army, and for the Marine Corps landing ship medium, which used to be called a Joint basically a warfighting capability to support Marine littoral regiments. Neither one of those platforms are being invested in the numbers and the timing to be able to operate there as well. So if we don't have sea lift to operate, we're going to have to then drive that backwards to airlift, which puts a huge burden on both C-130s and C-17s to operate over intra-theater distances. And couple that with emerging concepts like palletized munitions, you can see we can easily create an airlift problem in the Pacific to just sustain the force, much less operate and do some of the unique things we're asking for as well. And lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the enablers are still critical for us. The ability to operate in dynamic areas for airfields and seaports will be a challenge for us. And so those enablers are the critical connective tissue, especially when we look at dynamic activity, where we have to look at alternate basing or other places we're going to be leapfrogging around to in the Indo-Pacific theater. So the next slide really talks about where we've focused on, and we've basically said, you may have heard the term last tactical mile. In the Indo-Pacific, really it is the last tactical 1,000 miles. We've done the work to look at where we have sources of supply and sources of support, and the ability to operate two operating locations really is about 1,000 miles. So anything inside 3 days will drive us to an airlift solution, and about that 3-day point was where we need watercraft to be able to operate with the larger scale movements there. But these lines of effort really are what we're now focusing on. Again, setting the theater, again, we cannot posture without the problem, but be able to position forces early and provide a deterrent effect, hopefully avoid conflict. And then, of course, deploy in a contested environment. And then a new area for us is maneuvering forces. We haven't thought about this really in the past, but we're moving intact combat capability in the Pacific theater. That is a new mobility mission we see. And lastly, sustaining the force, where things like Class 5 munitions, we don't have enough to be able to put it in the theater, so we'll have to move some of those in at the time of need. And then if you look at what's going on in both Ukraine and for Israel, you can recognize that the ability to sustain the fight is really based upon fuel and munitions. That'll be a key commodity we have to worry about. The last thing I'll point out is in the past, we've had the luxury of having a perimeter of the problem where we could provide commercial solutions and operate to the interior for things like Class 9 reparables. That will be even more challenging in the Pacific. To now we have to integrate those into a logistics supply chain activity to provide those warfighting commodities into those locations where they're being consumed. This is an area that we have to really, I think, pay more attention to for how we don't get surprised. And so at the bottom there, you see some areas that we have to really worry about. How do we synchronize across the vast distances of the Indo-Pacific, where many of those moves look like strategic movement, but now are being controlled by Transcom with their transition into the Pacific theater? What's the role of the Army potentially even to look at their theater sustainment command for how they're managing logistics at the joint level? There's areas of uncertainty. Some of these demands may be very much tied to dynamic operations, to how we may, if we're not anticipating those, could find ourselves being reactionary. And one of the things I don't mean this kind of in jest, but one of the things we don't want to do is be like Southwest Airlines last Christmas, where they basically got behind and they could not catch up, and the system was so brittle, they had to kind of reset the theater, their theater being able to operate in the domestic space here, and then bring that back up. And I don't think we can afford to do that. So the ability to anticipate and stay ahead of the problem, which is why this decision advantage component is so important to our ability to see and understand what's happening in front of us. And lastly, as I mentioned before, there's some key commodities that will be very difficult probably to estimate, and our ability to try to, again, do our best that we can to bound those problems so we can at least create options where we have the ability to put those in motion will be one of the key things we see for how we're going to have to operate in the Indo-Pacific. I did mention before some of the areas where the adversary is going to be quite active. I think I don't need to inform you that the China problem is becoming quite daunting. But the real issue for us is now we have to fight to get to the fight. So many of you may recognize that even in the domestic space, when we're doing power projection from our bases and garrisons here, cyber activity will be quite confounding for us because of the ability to have China do that today. They're doing a lot of what I call intelligence collection of the battle space so they can employ that at a time of need. And that's where we're going to have to be more thoughtful about how we can overcome and mitigate cyber impacts. And one of the areas we're most concerned about is not only the networks and nodes we operate through, but a command and control center would be a high consequence activity to where if they were able to interdict that would be a real problem for us. So we have to fight to get to the fight from the homeland. The closer we get into the theater, we'll have to go into a contested set of activities, and that will then become quite daunting. And the impact is not only the loss of the mobility assets, but the loss of the combat capability that's inside those assets will be almost impossible to replace. And so that will also require us to be pushed back to operate from more locations that we can protect, and how we operate at that distance will also be challenging. And lastly, I think most of you recognize that it's a joint response we have to provide for the ability to secure and protect air bases and seaports, and that requires other services to contribute to that, and those assets required to protect us, specifically air-based defense in terms of missile defense, will also have to be put in early to be able to allow us to operate, which will be part of the risk calculus. And lastly, I'll point out that China and Russia both are quite adventurous in terms of trying to impact access basin overflight. Our ability to understand to what degree they can put us at risk and what allies and partners will be of high confidence allies and partners, and those that may be put at risk because of the influence they have in their malign activity, even under the lead up and during wartime activities, will be a challenge for us. Again, what we're seeing though is we do have some very strong allies and partners in the Pacific that we do think will be able to support us. But those lesser ones that create real challenging areas, and again, I won't go into some of those locations, but I think you can probably envision who those are. Those will be the ones that we're going to have some real focus so we can operate from there if we do that reliably, and that's going to be one of the key concerns. And so that's really where I wanted to stop today, and I just wanted to give you kind of a glimpse of what we're looking at U.S. Transcom for the macro level trends. And I guess, for our perspective, the areas that we're most concerned about, I think that I mentioned before, area fueling as a global problem will always continue to be a challenge for us. How we understand and provide assets to where we don't have enough in the inventory to do that will be an issue. How we look at the theater and how we manage the theater activity as it transcends over distances that look really strategic by its very nature. How we're very flexible with our command relationships and our command and control apparatus will be another area I think that will be challenging for us. I know some of the observations that came out of Mobility Guardian this year, I think points to that as an area we're going to have to continue to sharpen our pencils on. And lastly, how we really look in terms of how we mitigate and set conditions for us to operate with a very capable adversary who's growing in their potential to be able to put us at risk will also be an area that we're going to have to be able to confidently be able to address that as well. Again, I told Rob I'd kind of transition over to him. He's got, I think, maybe a longer view to provide some, maybe a different perspective on capabilities. But I'm hoping that's generated some ideas for some questions that may be helpful to anticipate where we're going with our current work and where we see some of the risks going in the future. And Rob, will turn it over to you.
Okay, that's always a dangerous thing. I'm going to stand up because I'm a professor and that's what we do when we talk. First of all, just questions, Q&A, we don't really have a provision for Q&A to come in on a cell phone and be announced to us and so on, but I wanted to tell you that Bruce and I will be available when we're done, either here or if we get pushed out in the foyer, if anybody has any specific questions or corrections or anxieties you want to express to us. So we are available. I'm a believer that any futures discussion, which is about what I'm about to do, should never be just an official position. There should be many people involved, many postures and so forth. I once heard somebody say diversity is not hearing the same thing 3 times, it's actually hearing the same topic in 3 different ways. And so I value that, and I'm always interested in what people have to say. The other thing is we're missing the middle speaker of this. We were going to have Mike Brenner from AMC-AA talk about how AMC, in a sense, was going to be addressing or thinking about addressing some of the problems that Bruce brought up in light of Mobility Guardian. Bruce was called away by duty, and nobody can do his job but him, so I'm just going to break to my topic, which is a little more focused, and it's going to be about theater airlift modernization. There are 2 big questions about theater airlift out there. The first one is how to get in such bad shape in relationship to the likely requirements we're going to face. Bad shape in terms of capacity and also the configuration of the fleet. That's actually a pretty simple story, but it takes a really complicated background discussion for it to start to make sense. The other question is, okay, so how do we fix it? Well, that's a story of a lot of moving, interconnected pieces. Each one is actually fairly simple to talk about, but they get complicated when you try to relate them to one another. You can't leave out different parts of the discussion to have the other one make sense. So I'm going to kind of focus on one particular area, and that is theater airlift modernization, particularly addressing what I see as one of the key gaps within the system, and basically to do what theater airlift does, which is to carry on the flow of assets into the theater, maybe augment the inter-theater flow, but also then to do the distribution process that Bruce talked about. My question is this: what's the airplane supposed to look like in general technology and capacity? So my question is, should the next airplane be a vertical takeoff and landing, which is an idea like dirigibles and civil military transports that pops up at regular intervals? It never works out, but it's one that needs to be settled. So should it be VTOL, or should it be something that I call super short takeoff and landing, rough field capability? The examples I'm going to look at are ancient, but I think they're good representative examples of the options that are available to us in terms of general aerodynamics and capabilities. So we'll be looking at something called the Brugo 941, excuse me, a new clicker. Okay, the Brugo 941, a French design. It generated its super STOL lift with a standard wing, but a blown wing with a blown Fowler flap on the back. Of course, the V-22, a sort of almost a helicopter, almost an airplane hybrid. And then something called the LTV XC-142, which was a tilt wing, originally designed as a VTOL, but it turned out to be a much better STOL. And then, of course, the CH-47 is a pure helicopter. This is what I'm going to do. You always have to have a plan so you can violate it. We'll talk about a quick definition of STOL and then general requirements, the Air Force's requirements, the Army's requirements for theater airlift. And then we'll take a look at, I'll throw some recommendations out, if nothing else, to invalidate my intellectual credibility. Okay, STOL, what is it? There is no official DoD definition. There is a definition for STOL, which is 1,500 feet over a 50-foot obstacle. STOL to me is less than 1,000 feet at standard sea level, maximum takeoff weight, and so on. That's when the short takeoff landing really starts to become meaningful. Not only for the distance landed, but what it does to the runway. The slower you can land on the runway, the less likely you're going to tear it up from shear forces on the touchdown and the braking action and so forth. So I use 1,000 feet over a 50-foot obstacle, again, no wind, standard conditions. So what are the general requirements? This is half of the Indo-Pacific, and we all know we've seen the drawings of the 3 United States stretched across. It's actually, I think it's 8.5 United States in area, so it's a gigantic place. Every place you want to go is a long way. So I kind of argue that maybe what is, when I talk about a theater airlifter, it should be able to fly at least 2,000 miles in a straight line carrying the long pole mobility items. Now, long pole may not be what you carry a lot or most often, but it's what you have to carry in key cases or key events to make the mission work. That gives you an 800 nautical mile, roughly round trip distance in a unrefueled situation. We often forget that. We talk about going to expeditionary airfields. There's going to be enough fuel. Is there going to be any fuel? So if it isn't, that's going to really cut down on the range of the aircraft, the operational range. Some other general requirements. I think it's going to be essential to have, and it's going to be essential for me to learn how to use this thing. First of all, great unpredictability in terminal operations. You can't let the other guy know where you are for very long. We aren't going to have any secret operations because they're always going to know where we are operating from. There are millions of enemy civilians scattered all over the Pacific. They all have cell phones. The key is what we do on the ground in terms of surviving, because they're going to know where we are, but they don't necessarily know where we're parked or if we're still there and how long and so on. So we need to maximize the time in the air of the aircraft because that's when they're least vulnerable. Achieve runway flexibility, be able to land anything from a mushy farm field to JFK Airport. Dynamically dispersed basing. We need to be able to actually shift the mobility basing on a regular interval. We talk about disaggregated combat operations, but that requires disaggregated mobility operations as well. And dynamically dispersed parking. Just because we're on the ground doesn't mean we stay in the same place. I'm an advocate. Every mobility aircraft should have its own tug, and it should move every hour when it's on a base, the widely dispersed areas on the base. Survivable damage tolerance, maybe using the best approach to damage tolerance is not get hit. Speed, self-defense capability, probably. Stealth. Stealth is always seductive. We love talking about it. I don't think stealth's going to last very much longer, but even if it does, it's very hard to maintain when you're landing on rocks and gravel somewhere. And it costs in terms of performance trade-offs. I'm not too sure that's really the future of transport aircraft. And then obviously maintainability. Your onboard crew chief should be able to do a lot of the fixing if necessary with the crew helping. The Air Force's requirements are actually more robust than some people think. By the time you throw in munitions and and fuel and so forth, and again on disaggregated operations, your theater airlift may be bringing in the fuel. It's a lot of weight. Key items, P-19 fire truck may or may not go forward. You may require rest on fire bottles. But one thing you're probably moving around a lot are front loaders, excavators, and other rapid runway repair equipment. If I'm the bad guy and I know from a cell phone call that you're operating off a certain field and you may have fighters based on there already, I may not know where the fighters are, but I know where the runway is. So I'll cut it. And then how are you going to get out of there? And that's probably one big. If I know there's an aerial port in operation, I don't necessarily have to hit the C-17s. I mean, I know where they are at that moment in time, shooting a long-range system, but I can kill the aerial port. So everything's got to be fairly maneuverable. You can't assume anything is invulnerable, and theater airlift needs to play into that. The top end weight is about 50,000 pounds when you look at the engineering equipment. That would be your long pole. The Army is actually more complex in pieces, but its weight requirements may or may not be higher. I think based on my discussions with the Army, give up on me, whether you're looking at light forces or medium forces, the long pole is going to tend to be probably the new M10 protected gun system. Whatever they talk about, that's probably what they're looking at. And you need to expect about 90,000 pounds. Right now it's 80,000 pounds going into production, but you know they're going to find ways to make it heavier. So when you look down here at, same thing with the Patriot, 50 to 70,000 pounds, you know what kind of units we're going to move? I don't think we're going to move brigades. I think even the Army, from my discussions with them, they really know in their heart of hearts, they're not going to be moving brigades by air around the theater. That's going to be by ship or not at all once they get there. What they're really thinking more are task forces, battalion size, maybe even regimental size or smaller, to do things like occupy and hold key pieces of strategic terrain to deter, dissuade the enemy, or to place strategically air defense umbrellas that, or when the Air Force sets up somewhere, who's going to defend you against the close attacks? I can't hit you with missiles effectively, but if I can get in close, I can find you on the runway and kill you there. So how are we going to stop them from doing those kinds of attacks? We don't have that capability. The Army does. So we will probably move in that kind of stuff around as well. Their munitions and fuel requirements are relatively low compared to trying to sustain a fighter squadron somewhere. So what's the long pole bogey? I would argue that it's probably either 50,000 or 90,000 pounds on whatever design one comes up with. So again, what are the alternatives? And I want to talk about these systems, and I admit they're old and they were small, but it's the aerodynamics that we need to consider. The design parameters, I've talked to our engineers at Boeing, Embry-Riddle, and we've got a pretty good engineering department there, and what they said was, look, you can scale them up within limits. You can't really scale rotary wing up very well because of the stresses at the rotor hubs and so forth, but you can scale up things like tilting wings and so on relatively easy. So we're going to kind of look at these alternatives from that perspective. Think of them as examples, not necessarily as what we would build. So these are the four we talked about here, the Brigeau, the LTV, the Boeing Bell V-22, and the Boeing CH-47. Okay, this is a busy chart, so I'm going to kind of take it a line at a time. Here are examples. The 47, the Brigeau, the XC-142, or V-22. That's their basic design track that they follow. But the first really important information is the lift-over drag characteristics of the aircraft. The CH-47 is a pretty typical helicopter at 4.5. The Brigeau and the 142 were about 9s, and the V-22 is a 6.5. By comparison, the C-130 has an L/D of 14, and a Boeing 777 is 19. That's about as efficient as large transports get right now. Even a little difference in L/D makes a big difference in overall performance. They're all about the same size because at the time they developed these airplanes, they were looking for a light assault aircraft. The horsepower gives you some other indications. The Brigeau had almost 10 pounds of weight per horsepower, which says it's fairly efficient. The XC-142 was probably the least efficient because it had a VTOL capability, but it had relatively small propellers. So it needed a really high-speed, high-power power pack to push that thing off the ground and create 300-mile-an-hour downwashes too, by the way. And so when you look at how that played out in terms of ranges, you can see why a helicopter could never be, a pure VTOL could never be a theater airlifter. The range just simply isn't there, and it never will be. Whatever you can do to give it a few miles, you can do to these to give them a couple of 100 miles extra range. Otherwise, their cruise speeds are about the same. I'm sorry, this was the speed. I'll get the range there. Their cruise speeds were about the same. The 142 could actually do about 360 knots, but the drag coefficient was so, or the drag curve was so high that it just made no sense. So it cruised about like everybody else. Range is where it comes out to play. I took a representative 8,000-pound load. The CH-47, 160 miles. You can't do much better than that. The Brujo jumps out ahead of everybody at almost 1,400 miles, and then these two both at about 700. What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that it has a lower power to weight ratio, which means that it has a lower fuel burn and a better aeronautical miles per pound of fuel performance. So this turns out to be the range concept. The others give you maybe a little better takeoff distance using a tilt wing setting rather than VTOL, but you pay for that in terms of the size of the engines, the fuel consumption of the engines at cruise, and so on. So this is the interesting design to me, and the question I asked when I went and worked with our engineers was, what happens if I tilt that wing? What does that do to the gross weight of the airplane, and structural characteristics and so forth? And they said, well, not a whole lot, really, which is kind of surprising. If you're just tilting it, if you're trying to go vertical, it becomes a different problem. So here's my recommendation. Okay, in my effort to murder my reputation, but somebody needs to say something and step out and say, start here. Basically, what I would argue is the future, really, we should be thinking about a tilt wing or tilt engine, super short takeoff and landing aircraft, looking for about a 50-knot landing speed, thereabouts, 40s possible, and a landing roll over 50-foot obstacle around 500 feet. Okay? There's a lot of advantages to that particular makeup. It needs to have a power to weight ratio of STOL only, not for VTOL, which gives you a more efficient range payload. Also, the propellers and so forth have an effect on that. Some people say, what about a jet? Jets don't work in this environment. They're just too costly in weight and fuel and so forth. Not pure jets. There are ways to tie them into systems to make it better. What about VTOL? I mean, we need VTOL. The Army says they want VTOL. Well, my argument is this. Maybe, first, find out what's needed and affordable on the Army's table. What are they doing, what are they not doing? And ask them a really honest question. How many times are you going to operate where VTOL is essential and STOL wouldn't work well enough? That number, talking to the Aviation Center of Excellence, says, well, it's not really that, we don't really have many like that. And when I tell them I can put 20 of these STOL airplanes down on 1,000 feet of dirt somewhere in the same space you can get 20 CH-47s, then they sort of say, well, maybe we don't need it that much. So VTOL is maybe. You could integrate VTOL into an STOL design, has been done before. Actually, the other design started out as VTOL designs, became STOL. But you could integrate it, but once again, you start running into structural, power plant, and general operational drawbacks from that kind of a system. You could, if we have a role like special ops or other special missions where we need a VTOL, my first option, if I were recommending this, would be to take a look at what the Army and the Marines are doing and see if that would work for us. That's what we've done to this point about VTOL. It's probably the same case. But the idea, in my view, designing a 50-ton capable VTOL airplane is maybe possible, but the cost and the development complexities would outweigh it. So that's kind of what I had to say. I do point out that there are a number of articles out on this. These are mine, my contributions. They're there if anybody wants to look at them. And also my email address is on the cover, the title page or title slide, and I'm more than happy to talk about this stuff. With that, I think we're actually finishing a little early. What I would say is you can all stand up, give us a round of applause, and stand in amazed all at our knowledge and wisdom, and we'll come down here and take questions and let it go from there. Thank you very much. Bruce, do you have any? Thank you.